as a public relations company, obviously we're engaged in three things. Firstly, generating market awareness. This is a key task for most of our clients. Lead generation, increasingly important that people want to be able to quantify the results of their marketing communications campaigns. And then demonstrating company value is something which is especially important because of the ongoing cycle of merger and acquisition that companies go through acquisition after acquisition. If they're mature or if they are small, they are often in processes where they are trying to ensure that they are fairly valued by current investors or by future buyers. So let me start off by moving through some stuff, maybe a little abstract stuff perhaps about categories and why categories matter. Basically, what we've been doing is a twofold process. We're working together with friends at the Analyst Observatory at the University of Edinburgh, where we've been firstly understanding categories in a more theoretical way, trying to see what categories do and how they behave the way that they do. And then also going through a series of interviews. We've been interviewing analyst colleagues at several analyst firms. I think it's 6 analyst firms at the moment who we've been speaking to, and just trying to understand a little bit better what is this process that happens, and how do people do this category creation? What is the magic by which it unfolds? So why do categories matter? And indeed, what is a category? So it's worth kind of posing a couple of questions there. So firstly, what we mean by a market category is a defined subset of a market. So not just an exchange. You know, like if I paint a biscuit purple and I sell it to my uncle because he loves me, that doesn't suddenly mean that there's a market for biscuits with purple paint on. That's just an exchange. And categories are things which are defined and have organizing power. So they're groups of solutions, groups of technologies, and also customers are in that category. And categories are used by analysts heavily because if you fit, then you're recognized as being relevant. So of course it might be that something doesn't fit, might still be interesting. It might be something that works its way into a category in the future. But if you don't fit, then it's harder to understand you. It's harder to show that you are relevant. And a key point to that, of course, is this business model of the analyst firms. And there's a quote here in the sidebar that pulled out from one of the interviews that you were looking at, and I wonder maybe I might be able to refresh my browser, because I hear that works on the sound, and then maybe while I'm doing that, you might be able to just speak to that comment briefly.
Yeah, so I'm hoping you can all hear me. So as Duncan said, we were working together he was doing interviews and then I was reading the transcript and going through them and just seeing what the analysts were saying in regards to category creation and if we could find some kind of link between something that everyone was saying. And we got to the point that you can see here on the sidebar, which is that ultimately everything traces back to economic viability of the research, because people don't want to put their money in something that doesn't have a place within the market. And that was the point that Duncan started with in one of these interviews, and a point that I pulled out to be relevant. And yeah, we can see it here. And it was a common thread through not just that transcript, but through all of the 6 that we examined. And I'm seeing now that Duncan has not come back. I saw him pop back briefly, and he's here. Okay. Is he back? I'm hoping he can hear me.
I don't know what's going on with my sound. So what seems to be happening for me is when my microphone is on, I can't hear you. Really irksome. and when I disappear, when I hide as a presenter, then I can hear you. It's absolutely crazy. I'm sure there's something I'm doing wrong here, but we'll work it out. But I think if it's okay, what I might do is just go on to the next slide and then bring you back in on the next quote that we brought out from the field work. One of the interesting pieces for me, and an important reference work for me on categories, has been the work of Elizabeth Ponticus, who's a scholar who did some amazing work at the University of Chicago. It has now just started at Berkeley. But what she has been doing is looking at the way that categories behave across many markets, and then drilling down more deeply into the experience of analyst categories and what analyst categories do to the way that markets function. So the steps in reasoning in Ponticus's work, and I've put a picture up here of a book that she's contributed to that really explores the idea of categorization in markets, is that basically if you're not in a category, there's no major market. You know, you might be selling something, but if there's not a framework around you, then you're not there. You know, you think, for example, of oat milk. You know, I go to my local supermarket, and in the chiller with the dairy products, there is oat milk. And obviously oat milk isn't a dairy product, and it doesn't need to be in the chiller. But it's there, it's categorized, and therefore it's in a market, and therefore it has competitors, and therefore it's able to access much more demand than it might do otherwise, because it's in a category. And so a market category is more than there being demand for it or there being supply of it. It's a definition, it's a piece of infrastructure that brings together demand, and it's something that provides categories that are both used by vendors to make their products work better, fit more closely to the expectations of buyers who want to buy a solution like that. And it's a tool for analysts. It helps analysts to be able to get their work recognized, to get their research read, to move forward with it. So what it means is that without a market space, without a defined category, it's very hard for analysts to get their customers to read their research. So if you've got a category that's reflected in a wave or a magic quadrant or something like that, you get a lot more readers, a lot more interaction than if you don't. And it also has a big impact on business outcomes for the firms that are in these category type pieces of evaluation. So Ponticus did this incredible research looking at almost 1,400 magic quadrants over a period of many years, I think around 14 years, and found that if you are more similar to other products, so that similarity is represented by how closely you resemble the full set of criteria that analysts use to define a category. So, for example, in a critical in a core capabilities document where they define what's necessary. If you're a firm that really represents closely what is expected for the ones that are in your category, you have 57% higher sales than if you're kind of in the category but rather on the edges and not really being able to reflect the expectations for solutions in the category. I should also say there is a questions panel. If you want to type things into the question, we've got a few kind of break slides with big colorful numbers on through the deck. So feel free to ask any questions. We can come back to them and address any questions. I'm glad to see that people are finding coming back into the webinar is generally working for sound. So there are some things that are happening. There are some options that are at work when these categories are being used. Certainly what we've seen is that categories are a kind of heavy lifting for analysts. Yeah? So analysts are, when they're weighing up the option to create or not create a new category, one of the important things for them is that everything has to move. You create a new category and so everything has to shuffle along. White space gets filled. And that can disturb a taxonomy, and by doing so, it disturbs the relationships of people in the analyst firm. So a great example of that today, people will have seen that Informer's technology research companies, so Ovum, IHS Markit, Informer Tech, Heavy Reading, and so on, they are rebranding and relaunching under the name of Omdia. And Omdia needs to have a new taxonomy, a new organization, new teams, new ways of allocating analysts to teams. So that's not just musical chairs, it's a different way of creating new spaces, and it will change the way the analysts are working and change the way that the vendors perform back to the analysts, the criteria that Omdia analysts have for including or excluding or deciding where you're filed. The other thing about category creation that we found out is that category creation is really co-creation. Yeah? One vendor, one analyst firm, one buyer can't create a new category. These categories are co-created by an ecosystem. And so a big part of what we find that our clients are doing, if they're being successful, even at putting down the foundations of a new category, is that they are finding a category that will work for other players, and gathering these players together into an ecosystem is an essential part of what is going on. And it can be triggered almost magically. Now, Zoe, I think you found a quote that kind of reflected that kind of magical happenstance.
Yeah, in one of the transcripts I was looking at, I found this quote here, which you're all going to have to forgive the wording of it, which was done by automatic transcription. But it was basically describing that when people don't know where to put something, it puts it into a box of unknown, obviously. And then as soon as you create some kind of buzz around it or create the category, it gets a lot more people interested and talking about it and talking about the change that is happening. So the idea of category creation in itself gets people excited and gives itself a place within the market. And yeah, Duncan has gone again, I presume, to hear me. Yeah.
So that's basically a foundational summary, I suppose, of what we discovered. I'm just going to pause for a second in case there are any questions that people want to tap into the chat panel. But what I want to do next is really go into like the state of the art. You know, when we speak to scholars and to practitioners in industries who are attempting to engage in this kind of strategic market creation, what are the main variables that they are working with? And that's really the starting point that we used in these interviews, in the blog post that some of you may have seen on the CC Group blog, and in this idea of the market menagerie. So just to define this notion of ecosystem, and in a way it's touched on by the way that the quote that Zoe was using on the previous slide describes it. You know, in the process of formation of a new market, there are conversations about new solutions and new technologies, and the vocabulary for it forms at the same pace as the business opportunity. So I'll say a little bit more than that, but there is a wide ecosystem of vendors, of partners, of industry analysts, of course, who are looking at the market. But one key thing that is essential is for a market to cohere, to be well defined as a category, to develop coherence, to become widely visible, then it needs to make sense economically. And there's a lovely piece that's just come out in the Academy of Management Review that really goes through this with a really strong empirical grounding and shows how this happens. But while this process happens in many markets, what we see in the analyst industry is that when analysts are telling us about a market being commercially realistic, it's really two kinds of realism. Firstly, it means it's got to be realistic for analysts' customers to want to engage in this technology. Analysts have to see, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but analysts have to see that there's a realistic business possibility opening up there. But also there's a second kind of realism, which is it has to work for the company. Financially, the business case has to be there for them to take the effort, to take the risk, to disturb their own operations, and to start to cover something, not just as a topic. You might write about a topic in passing, but then not devote an ongoing level of effort to defining it and to curating a list of the vendors that are inside it. So that first thing is really important, that it has to be commercially realistic. The second thing that comes up is that the category has to make sense in some way. It has to be easy to explain what this category is. So categories are co-created, co-assembled. Communities develop, conversations develop. People are juxtaposing, experimenting, scrambling around, trying to find ways to describe this new market that's in formation, or this idea for a market that could come to be created. And ideally, people are doing that with the language that is already in the domain. So using familiar notions, analogies, using terminology that people will be familiar with, but maybe combining it in new ways. So certainly what we see is that if analysts try to introduce categories that have got very unwieldy, clumsy namings, they tend to fail, and that certainly comes through in Elizabeth Ponticus's evaluation. What she sees is that many Magic Quadrants are never refreshed. Yes, they're, in a sense, it's dead on arrival. They come out once, they don't take off, life doesn't breathe into them, vendors and customers don't talk about them. They need a certain graspable terminology. So this thing about coining phrases and strap lines is a real art. Actually, one of my colleagues at CC Group, who's old school, Duncan, was involved in coining the phrase "the human network," which was used widely in the networking space. The effort involved in coining these phrases can be very accidental and sometimes very intensive. So I know there's a quote that you found in the transcripts that jumped out at you on that. So
yeah, as some of you will notice, that is the same quote from the previous slides. What I'm thinking is, Duncan, there's a question here in the chat that I'm hoping you can answer, if you can hear me, that is. And then you can pop in and answer that, because, like I said, this is the previous quote. Yeah, perfect, he can. So he'll jump back in now and answer that for you, Robin.
There must have been another fantastic quote that I've terribly abused. I'm sorry. But yeah, just to come to that, come to that question on who exactly is in the ecosystem. I suppose there are two ways of viewing this. One is just who's in the conversation around the set of topics. If you've got a category that hasn't been created yet, so a really I'm trying to think of a really interesting example here. Like, I was speaking to a financial technology analyst who is looking at governance, risk, and compliance. And one of the issues that matters to them is assessing credit risk. And obviously, there are lots of technologies for assessing credit risk. Credit scoring in something more like a consumer business, or when you were evaluating businesses. But then that might also be in investment banking, looking at country risk, looking at currency risk. There are a number of aspects, dimensions to this. If this was to be crystallized into a category, the people who are currently talking about these different elements of the problem, different ways of solving the problem, they are the ecosystem. But it's loosely bound. They might know each other, they might be working on similar products, similar solutions, similar problems, but it's only by the articulation of these people, the joining together of these people into community, starting common conversations, common gatherings, common vocabulary. It's only in that process that they come together. And the vocabulary that they use, forming the common vocabulary, developing a common language, is a central task to developing that kind of community. So in a way, community has to be generated around symbols and ideas before it comes apart. And engaging vendors who potentially you compete with, in a certain sense, it's a little bit easier to engage in a market category that doesn't exist. You know, all of you would benefit from the creation of that. And of course, vendors are made up of humans, you know, and humans are increasingly curious and increasingly less respectful of the organizational boundaries that separate us. So, you know, very often you'll find people who might compete, you know, like public relations agencies compete, but we also play very nicely with other public relations agencies. You know, vendors in most markets actually are able to cooperate very easily. And the intellectual life, the thought leadership activities that engage, typically will span across firms. So it's something that can happen in a very difficult way, in a formal organization to organization way, but probably that happens after it happens in an informal way of developing thought leadership communities. There's a lot more that we can say about that, and later on I talk about our brochure where we step through some of these things in a more structured way. So these two dimensions that we have, you know, this idea of the market being realistic and the language being familiar, gives us this cute little diagram, which our colleague Andrea made for us, that in a way there are four kinds of potential markets. And three of these potential kinds face extreme obstacles in coming into life. And the fourth one just faces, you know, regular obstacles in coming into life. So some new markets are realistic. They're clearly, there's clearly a possibility for a large number of vendors and customers to come together in this category. And it seems legitimate. It's described in a way that makes sense. So you can imagine, for example, from my earlier example, credit technologies. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Or credit scoring, right? That kind of makes sense. You know, there's a large enough pool of vendors maybe existing there. The phrases are simple enough that you would kind of understand what that means. So it's got the potential to become an eagle. Another example, so one of the clients that we work in has got a solution which is in a Gartner Magic Quadrant that's got such a complicated name that even I struggle to remember the name of it. It's something like high performance enterprise infrastructure platforms as a service. It's something like that, right? You know, I've been working on this and similar Magic Quadrants full time. Even I can't remember the name of it. Maybe that says more about me than about the complexity of it. But I think it's fair to say that a market category with such a tongue twister for a name is not going to be able to reproduce itself. Yeah, it won't develop major adoption, even if it's useful for a small group of industry insiders. So that is something, you know, like a dodo. You know, it's kind of realistic. You can see what it is. You can understand why it might be viable in a certain setting, but actually it's not going to take off. It's not going to be adopted. It's not going to diffuse as a process of terminology. Then we've got things which are unrealistic. There's no way that they can work as markets, but you could describe them in a way that they make sense. You know, government regulation of analyst firms. You know, we can absolutely all understand what that would look like. We can imagine what that would look like as a compliance activity. There's no way it's going to happen. Yeah, really easy to understand it. There's no way it's going to happen. So that's a black swan. You know, so unrealistic, so unlikely to happen, but we could completely imagine it. We have no problems without imagining it. And then finally, we have the rainbow raven. You know, there are no ravens that are colored like rainbows, I believe. So it's something that's completely unrealistic, and actually that we would even struggle to imagine what it looks like. So very often these are hoped for markets by single vendor marketing departments who think that they can create a market category, even though they are the only people doing it. There's no real competition. It's not really valid as a market. So that creates a kind of paradox for markets. We've seen from the research of Elizabeth Ponticus, once you get into one of these categories, or once one of these categories is created, you and all the vendors accelerate. Yeah, we definitely see this even in the case of the kind of candidate categories that are things like Gartner Magic Quadrants, sorry, Gartner Cool Vendor designations. Once that is created, it accelerates the market. But there's a tension there, isn't there? That market categories can't really be widely adopted until the analysts define them, because the analysts have a vital role for investors, for channel partners, for systems integrators, for the whole value chain. But on the other hand, analysts don't create these markets until the market is seen as being viable. And so what goes on here is not the simplistic view that vendors create the categories, and not the simplistic view that analysts create the categories, but actually that there is a co-creation process where things start to form, and then they overcome a series of hurdles. There are a series of milestones that mark the maturing as an idea evolves into a market category. And it seems to be quite frustrating when companies try to unilaterally announce the arrival. And Zoe, I think there's. Let me move on now to a little bit more of what we've found in these conversations. So we've seen from what we've heard in the past, what we've seen from our own experience, what academic scholars have drawn out, this idea that there are two factors, two elements that if you combine will lead to success for a market category. One of them is the viability of the market. The other is the realism, the legitimacy of the terminology. But we've seen through these interviews that we've been conducting over the last few weeks, some other things are at work as well. Let me run through a few of these, and then I'll try to hand the microphone back to Zoe a little bit more smoothly than I did last time. One thing that we're seeing is that actually there doesn't need to be a viable market now, and even the path to viability doesn't necessarily seem to be very clear. But if there's a promise of growth that seems to be realistic, maybe the path isn't clear, maybe the value proposition isn't clear, maybe how this technology will monetize itself isn't yet completely clear. But if the promise is strong enough, it can compensate for that lack of categories, for that lack of clear financial validity. And it could be that something that seems to be unviable now, but will be unviable in the future, could start to attract attention if analysts are convinced that the value proposition will mature in the medium term. Second thing that we've seen is that there's a kind of Goldilocks zone in terms of how large or how complex a market should be. So imagine something like credit technology, to come back to my earlier example. And actually, credit technologies are not just apples and oranges, but apples and oranges and tigers and chairs. So there are too many different technologies that are engaged in a very high level category. It might be a very big number, it may be a very big market, but actually it's too much like hard work to try to define it, to segment it, and to go to work on it. And then there's a medium level, like you might have something like credit scoring technologies. And that is big enough that you could think of a way of defining it that would include a large enough number of vendors to make it addressable and interesting. You'd have enough vendors at play there. And then you could have a category that is too small, credit scoring for European student loans, something like that. that is probably too small a category, because you need a certain number of vendors, at least a dozen vendors, 2 dozen vendors, to justify categorizing and comparing the players in a market. So some categories might be easy to get to work on, easy to produce a precise definition, but it just might not be large enough to be viable. And then the third thing, of course, is client interest. Clients may not be interested in buying this technology, but they might be interested in buying research or reading research about the technology. So you can see, for example, there are lots of technologies that have got huge promise, like blockchain, like artificial intelligence, like analytic solutions, where maybe there may be kind of more hype than light and value in these technologies at a certain stage, but analysts may find that it will make sense to try to define categories, try to subset categories, even as they are maturing, because conversations are happening now with clients. And it helps them to structure their advisory work, to develop consulting activities, to help customers to understand what research they should be engaging with. So, Zoe, I'm going to hand it over to this quote here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to not turn off my microphone until I see that you are speaking, and then I hope that will work.
Okay. So yeah, I really just want to echo what Duncan has said there, and that's a point that came across quite strongly in the transcripts, was that even at the beginning of these markets, when they are growing, it's a good time to get them into the press and the media, because analysts can get their name out there and then they resonate well within those spaces, which helps them with growth, obviously. And the analysts backing behind this really pushes it forward into the forefront. So even if there was even if they don't necessarily think there's a market for it right then, the conversations that you can have around that really put it into a viable space for it to sell well. Yeah, that's all I really want to echo on that.
Thank you. The other thing that we've seen in our process is just a clearer idea of where the obstacles are to these candidate categories maturing and coming to fruit. Obviously, one of them is this idea of the Goldilocks zone. That one of the things that analysts are concerned about is that if they pick a category that's just a little bit too detailed, then it may not get adoption. If you've got a category that could grow too quickly, then it could quickly grow outside this Goldilocks zone, and it could become unwieldy and not usable. The other idea is something might be super interesting, but it's a topic, not a category. It's super interesting person to go on a date with, but you definitely wouldn't want to see them again. But something that they might want to review, but it might not look substantial enough or have enduring enough value for it to ripen. And Zoe, I think I can speak for you on this little sidebar here. The other obstacle there is that some of these ideas are fake, obscure, meaningless, and sadly to say, many of them are coming from those of us kind of on the supply side of the market. There are many marketing-driven campaigns to develop categories which can't even co-opt pay-to-play analysts, and they really struggle to mature. There are some other things that we've seen, and especially this idea of a disturbance in the force. That creating a new category doesn't just mean that this category exists. Everything happens. Everything shuffles along. This category might absorb white space. I mean, actually, this is another lovely example that I can illustrate, thinking of the way that Omdia, this new Informa Tech research brand, it consolidates all of the research brands. So that means something straightforward. It merges IHS Market and Informa and the Informa Tech analysts and heavy reading. But then it also disturbs other things, the relationship between heavy reading and light reading. What happens to that? You know, other organizations with hybrid business models suddenly work. So this might mean that suddenly, you know, new alliances, new categories have to be formed around it. It might eat up something from something else. So we've got 15 minutes left in our, let's say 15 left in our conversation. And what I want to go into now is our category creation process. And again, I have to stress, you know, category creation is category co-creation. Yeah, this is something that we've got some experience on. It's something that we can help clients to start, but ultimately it means you have to enroll an ecosystem, identify all of the other people who would benefit from the existence of this new category, and draw them together in community in order to convince analysts that that there is a promise that can be realized. Let me just take a sip of my water on this conveniently wordy slide that you can read over. I'll just drink some water before I come into this. So the challenge, as I think we've touched on earlier on, it's a make or break factor. You know, everybody knows that if you're on a Magic Quadrant, you sell a lot more than if you're not on a Magic Quadrant, even if you're in the worst possible location on it. But having a category, even if you're not in it, this also makes big differences. But what we see is that this process of identifying categories that could be created and of curating the conversations and the people needed to convince analysts that it's worth going ahead, this requires an extensive investment, but it produces huge benefits. You know, I was speaking to one peer recently about the experience that they had of now Magic Quadrant is established for their solution. They are in it. These kinds of happy days don't happen all the time. Actually, one of our clients is just got into a brand new Forrester wave, is in the leader quadrant of that brand new Forrester wave. Very happy time for them. But that was the consequence of a long process by which the analysts became convinced that this market needed to be described, and conversations about actually what was the functionality needed. And they needed to listen to the wider industry, listen to a broader conversation, including their customers, on how that was constructed. In a nutshell, this is what our process looks like when we're engaging with clients and helping them to start to move towards this. And each of the stages, of course, we have a go, no go process, and of course, increasing investment at every stage. The initial thing that we go through is a process of validating and planning what this new category might be like. So there's an extensive ideation process. We go through typically like 15 to 20 possible definitions, and then we'll validate them through a spoken word process. Then we will go through a test phase where we might take the 2 or 3 of these candidate ways of describing the new category, and we'll test them much more deeply in a kind of, you know, in-depth strategy day, where we're bringing together different stakeholders who we think can be involved in this process. And often we may find that we need to rework what we've come out from. And then the third stage is like starting up a community, mapping these potential beneficiaries of the new category, curating what they are doing, bringing them into contact with each other, trying to breathe life into this terminology. And then after it has become validated, after that category has started to accept that term, we need to keep it alive long enough for the analyst to notice it and to bring it into being in a more formal way. So that means that starting up the community isn't enough. We need to keep the engine running to prevent it being merged or forgotten or closure coming along with early stage categories. So that's an outline of our process and what we found out through these interviews. I'm going to pause now to see if there are any questions or comments that people want to chat into the chat bar. While I do that, I'm going to mute my microphone just in case there's anything that Zoe wants to add. But basically, what I think we'll do is just pause for a second to see if there are any questions or comments that people want to type in.
Duncan's explained that really well, so I don't really have anything to add, but we do welcome any questions that you have, and I'm sure Duncan will be able to answer them for you.
The other thing that I should mention, of course, is that we have this worksheet, this fact sheet on category creation. So I really encourage you to ask for that. That's the kind of thing that would be useful for you. We are always here for questions and conversations with peers, both people on the industry analyst side and for people on the supply side. And of course, we'd love to have an ongoing conversation with you, not just with the analyst relations team here at CC Group, but the whole company. We are lovely and we would love you to find out more about us. So if you have the opportunity, follow us on Twitter, follow us on other social media. Definitely follow us on Instagram so you can see Poppy, the little dog, who is our Chief Happiness Officer. And please, get in touch at any time if you've got questions and comments. Thanks so much to those of you who have stuck through the audio conundrum that I faced, and definitely my apologies and thanks to Zoe for being such a stalwart in dealing with this technology conundrum. None of these systems are perfect, but I think we found a new way in every webinar that technology can let us down. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Just a reminder, there will be a recording of the webinar here in a little while. It takes some time for the wheels to churn, but the recording will be here and you can come back, ask questions later on, or step through the findings at any time you want to. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Here's a reminder again of my email address. So if there are any questions you maybe don't want to ask in front of a dozen strangers or something, then email those questions over. Otherwise, we'll look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.